Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome. Today, we go to the skies above the Soviet Union in the Cold War for the story of the U-2 shootdown over Sverdlovsk. Dawn was breaking somewhere far below as the slim black aircraft sliced through the upper reaches of the atmosphere, alone in a cold, pale blue world. In the cramped cockpit of the U-2, Francis Gary Powers focused on his instruments more than the distant horizon, trusting the narrow band of airspeed that kept those long wings just above a stall and just below structural failure. At about 60,000 feet above the Soviet Union, there was almost no sense of speed, only a faint tremor in the airframe and the steady whir and click of the cameras buried in the fuselage. Each pass of film captured rail yards, airfields, missile sites, and factories that no Western pilot had ever seen from this vantage point. The mission felt clinical and technical, but the targets on that film were anything but abstract. The decisions tied to those images would shape the balance of nuclear power. Outside the canopy, the sky deepened into an indigo shade that most aviators would only see in photographs, and the curvature of the Earth showed itself beyond the slim wing. Below, Soviet cities and bases slid past in silence, seen only as patterns of roads, rivers, and runways. From Powers' seat in his pressurized suit, the world looked almost peaceful, like a detailed map unrolling beneath him. It felt almost unreal. Yet he knew that each town and airfield under his flight path belonged to a state that had sworn to shoot down any intruder it could reach. The calm view from above hid the fact that his presence, if detected, would trigger alarms across a vast air defense system. Powers had rehearsed this mission profile in detail, from the route and altitude changes to the emergency procedures he prayed he would never have to use. He had been briefed on the self-destruct mechanism for the aircraft's sensitive equipment and the small device he carried in case capture seemed inevitable. Those were ugly contingencies, spoken of quietly and then put away in the back of the mind. The mission plan rested on a simple core assumption that altitude itself would keep him beyond the reach of Soviet fighters and most ground-based weapons. That belief had been reinforced by years of earlier flights that had returned safely. Confidence rides along on the shoulder in missions like this. As the U-2 droned on toward the industrial heartland near Sverdlovsk, Powers had no way of knowing that this particular run would end not with a long glide into friendly territory, but with fire, a tearing airframe, and a parachute dropping into hostile fields. Far below the thin air where the U-2 cruised, the Cold War was in one of its tensest phases. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a contest defined by bombers, missiles, and ideology. Yet both sides operated under a fog of deep uncertainty. American leaders worried about a bomber gap and then a missile gap, unsure how many long-range aircraft and rockets the Soviet arsenal really contained. Traditional intelligence methods could not easily pierce a closed Soviet system that restricted journalists, controlled borders, and hid entire regions behind secrecy. High-altitude reconnaissance offered a blunt but powerful solution. From high enough above, you did not have to guess. You could look down and count. The U-2 existed to make that possible. It was a fragile-looking machine with glider-like wings and a thin fuselage, designed to climb above the reach of known fighters and anti-aircraft guns. To gain that performance, it sacrificed armor, weapons, and comfort, trading survivability in combat for the ability to loiter in a cold, thin band of air that most pilots would never experience. By 1960, U-2 flights had been slipping over the edges of the Soviet Union for years, launched from bases in Allied countries and aiming for recovery fields far from their starting points. The information they brought back shaped everything from defense budgets to diplomatic talking points. In Washington, that aircraft had become one of the most valuable tools for understanding an enemy that rarely showed its hand. The flight Powers was making on May 1st was not just another routine mission added to a long list. It was timed carefully, just weeks before a planned summit in Paris, where President Dwight Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were supposed to sit down and discuss easing tensions. If the mission succeeded, American analysts hoped to solidify their picture of Soviet missile deployments and capabilities, strengthening the position of the United States at the bargaining table. Accurate counts of launch sites and bomber bases could challenge exaggerated fears or confirm real dangers. The stakes were both military and political, and they were enormous. If the Soviets detected and brought down the aircraft, the risk ran in the opposite direction. The entire secret overflight program, which Washington publicly denied, would be exposed to the world. That would humiliate the United States on the international stage, hand Khrushchev a propaganda victory, and give him an excuse to blow up the very summit that might help keep nuclear war at bay. It is hard to imagine more weight resting on a single, thin-winged airplane and its lone pilot. As Powers' U-2 slid across Soviet territory near Sverdlovsk, it carried on its narrow spine the burdens of strategy, prestige, and a fragile hope for high-level diplomacy. The sky around him seemed empty, but the consequences of what happened next would be felt far beyond his cockpit. The sky around Powers still looked empty and calm, but by this point the risks around his mission were tightening. What happened to his aircraft over Sverdlovsk had its roots in years of decisions about how to see inside a closed empire. The story of that day began long before Powers climbed into his pressure suit. It started in conference rooms where generals and civilian leaders argued about how to peer into the heart of the Soviet Union without starting a war. Traditional high-altitude bombers could not simply wander across Soviet territory without risking a direct confrontation, and early satellite concepts were still more idea than reality. The answer was an odd-looking airplane with sailplane wings and a narrow fuselage, built to climb higher than known fighters and anti-aircraft guns could reach. It was a strange solution, but it fit the problem they faced. To achieve that performance, the aircraft was stripped of armor, weapons, and the usual comforts of a combat machine. Every pound saved meant a little more altitude, a little more time in the cold, thin band of air that most pilots would never enter. Behind the scenes, the project was run in deep shadow. A civilian intelligence agency directed missions that started on remote airstrips and were meant to end thousands of miles away, often on other continents. Officially, these flights did not exist. On planning maps and briefing slides, they were simply paths across blank spaces. Early missions probed cautiously, skirting the edges of Soviet territory before pushing deeper as confidence grew. Each successful overflight tested Soviet patience and defenses, yet it also seemed to prove the aircraft's safety. The cameras returned images that could read serial numbers on bombers and count missiles standing on their pads. Each safe landing reinforced the belief that altitude itself made the aircraft untouchable. One short idea took root. High enough meant safe enough. On the other side of the Cold War line, the Soviets were not standing still. Every time a U-2 track appeared on radar, Soviet air defense officers gained another data point. They studied those traces, drilled their crews, and refined their tactics. Radar coverage grew denser. Plotting rooms became more efficient at handing off tracks. New surface-to-air missiles were built specifically to reach the thin layer of sky where the U-2 roamed. American planners understood some of this in theory, but the pressure for hard intelligence before summits and budget fights kept the missions on the schedule. By the spring of 1960, each flight over Soviet territory felt less like a quiet technical exercise and more like a roll of the dice. The route Powers would fly on May 1st reflected all of those tensions. It had been argued, adjusted, and refined at the highest levels of government, a compromise between risk and the hunger for one more haul of film. The idea was to cross key industrial and military regions, photograph missile and bomber sites, and exit through friendly territory on the far side. It was, in essence, an attempt to squeeze one last major mission into a window that everyone suspected was closing. The stakes were high, and everyone involved knew it. On the morning of the flight, Powers' U-2 climbed steadily away from its launch field, arcing towards Soviet airspace as fuel burned off and the aircraft lightened. As it settled into its fragile high-altitude groove, the airplane seemed to hang between Earth and space. Far away, Soviet radar operators began to notice an intruder that did not match any known civilian or routine military pattern. The track was slow, very high, and persistent, drifting over regions that were already sensitive and heavily watched. It stood out on their scopes. Controllers passed the blip from station to station, tracing its movement and trying to match it against planned flights and known aircraft. It quickly became clear that this was not a stray airliner or a simple navigation error. This was another American spy plane. Fighters scrambled and clawed for altitude, but getting near the U-2's flight level at the right point in space and time was extremely difficult. The task of actually striking the intruder fell to missile regiments that had been training for exactly this scenario. The duel was moving from tracking screens to launch rails. As Powers adjusted course over central targets and monitored his systems, missile crews on the ground were aligning launchers and receiving their fire orders. Surface-to-air missiles roared off their launchers in thunder and smoke, climbing on bright columns of flame toward a target that was barely visible on their tracking scopes. The same high, thin air that made the U-2 such an efficient glider also left it exposed. There was almost no room to maneuver without risking a stall or structural failure. At that height, big, sudden turns could be deadly even before any warhead detonated. In practice, that meant the pilot's best defense was to hold steady and hope to remain outside the envelope of the intercept. On this day, that envelope had grown wider than American planners believed. Near Sverdlovsk, explosions tore the air close enough to buffet the U-2's long wings and shake the delicate airframe. One short moment of shock changed everything. A blast finally damaged the aircraft badly enough that it could no longer hold together in the thin sky. The U-2 began to break apart, shedding pieces that spiraled down toward the fields and forests below. Inside the disintegrating machine, Powers fought to escape as the aircraft tumbled and tore itself apart. Training took over in those chaotic seconds. He separated from the wreckage and his parachute opened, leaving him suddenly alone in a bright daytime sky over hostile territory. The mission had transformed in an instant from a silent reconnaissance run to a struggle for survival. Below, villagers and security forces saw the strange object descending under a parachute and moved quickly to intercept. On the ground, scattered fragments of the once untouchable aircraft lay in fields, roads, and woods. A machine that had symbolized unreachable altitude now existed in broken pieces that could be photographed, studied, and displayed. In the span of a few minutes, the technical duel between altitude and air defense had been decided. The U-2 had fallen, and its pilot was now in Soviet hands. The political and diplomatic fight that would follow was only beginning. The political and diplomatic fight that followed the crash near Sverdlovsk did not start with speeches or press conferences. It started with quiet realizations on both sides about what had just happened and why. The decisive shift in Powers' mission had not come from a single button press or one unlucky burst of shrapnel. It had grown from months of quiet change inside Soviet air defense units and a steady overconfidence in Washington. The United States had built the U-2 around the assumption that flying far higher than conventional bombers meant flying beyond reach, and that assumption was about to be proven wrong. Each successful overflight had seemed to prove the point that altitude equaled safety. The pressure for more imagery before summits and speeches made it easier to treat risk as a kind of background noise, always present but never decisive. Yet every time a U-2 track appeared on Soviet radar, commanders on the other side gained another chance to calibrate their systems, drill their crews, and refine their tactics. They were learning with every pass. By the spring of 1960, the aircraft's greatest strength had quietly turned into a fixed, predictable target in the sky. On the day Powers flew, several of those long-term trends converged. Soviet radar coverage was denser than before, missile crews were better trained, and new surface-to-air weapons had the altitude and speed to reach into the U-2's thin sanctuary overhead. Powers' options at that height were brutally limited because even a modest attempt to nudge the aircraft away from a missile track risked a stall and structural failure before any warhead even detonated. When the missile blast finally crippled the long-winged aircraft, it exposed another American miscalculation. Planners had counted on the idea that the pilot and the sensitive hardware would never fall into enemy hands because both would be destroyed if anything went wrong. In reality, Powers survived, conscious and captured, and significant pieces of the wreckage remained intact enough to be studied and displayed. What turned this incident from a dangerous mission into a full-blown crisis was not only the shootdown itself, but the way the United States chose to respond. American officials initially released a cover story about a weather research aircraft that had gone off course, assuming that little evidence remained on the ground. It was a gamble based on the old belief that nothing useful would survive a breakup at that altitude. When the Soviets unveiled the wreckage, the cameras, and Powers himself, the story collapsed in public and in real time. The combination of Soviet persistence, new missile technology, American risk tolerance, and a failed attempt at plausible deniability transformed one reconnaissance flight into a turning point in the politics of the Cold War sky. In the immediate aftermath, the consequences rippled outward from a few fields near Sverdlovsk to the highest levels of global diplomacy. Powers was interrogated and tried in a Soviet court, placed at the center of a propaganda storm that portrayed the United States as an aggressor violating sovereign airspace. In Washington, the failed cover story forced officials to acknowledge the existence of the overflight program. President Dwight Eisenhower ultimately took responsibility, arguing that the need to prevent surprise attack justified aggressive reconnaissance deep into hostile territory. That explanation did little to ease anger in Moscow. The Paris summit that had been framed as a chance to cool tensions instead dissolved under public accusations and walkouts. A single airplane had helped wreck a rare opportunity for direct talks, just as both sides were piling up nuclear weapons. The U-2 program did not end overnight, but the rules of the game changed sharply. Deep penetration flights over the Soviet heartland were halted, and the search accelerated for alternatives that could gather similar intelligence without sending a pilot across defended borders. Space-based reconnaissance, once treated as a distant concept, suddenly looked less like science fiction and more like a strategic necessity. Later high-speed, high-altitude aircraft would enter service, promising new ways to skirt defenses, but they always flew under the shadow of what had happened to Powers and his machine. For Soviet planners, the Shootdown validated years of investment in integrated air defenses and surface-to-air missiles. Those lessons would echo in later conflicts far from Sverdlovsk. Today, the story of the U-2 and the Powers shootdown is more than a Cold War curiosity sitting behind museum ropes. It lies at the intersection of technology, intelligence, and statecraft that modern audiences recognize in debates over satellites, surveillance aircraft, and unmanned drones. The same core questions linger. How far will a state go to see inside a rival's defenses? How much risk will leaders accept to reduce uncertainty about an opponent's true strength? How quickly can a single mission, successful or failed, derail broader diplomatic efforts that took years to arrange? These questions remain very much alive in the 21st century. For students of military history, for officers planning staff rides, and for visitors standing beneath a U-2 suspended in a museum hall, the lesson remains stark. Tools built to fly too high to touch can still fall when an opponent adapts, and when they do, the impact is felt far beyond the crater or the wreckage field. A single reconnaissance flight can alter budget lines, alliance politics, and summit meetings in ways no one sitting in the cockpit can see at the time. The Powers Shootdown reminds listeners that intelligence work is never just about machines and images. It is about the fragile link between what leaders think they know and how they choose to act on that knowledge. You can hear more stories like this in the narrated Headline Wednesday features that run as part of the Dispatch audio editions, alongside other coverage of United States military history. For ongoing conversation and daily facts, there is also a community of readers and veterans in the United States Military History Group on LinkedIn, where events like the U-2 Shootdown are discussed, debated, and remembered. Headline Wednesday is developed by trackpads.com as part of Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine.